One of the intriguing features of John's Gospel, and this has already been pointed out by both of our keynote speakers thus far, are these encounters that Jesus has with individuals. I really liked the way Bruce presented that last night with the thought from the Norman Rockwell paintings. There's always someone in those paintings that just seems to be inviting you into that experience. And during our program this year, as we're looking at the Gospel of John, we have selected 3 of those encounters, and we're looking at one of those during each of the class time sessions. Nicodemus, the woman at the well, and the man born blind. Of course, Nicodemus was just this last class session. Right next door on the other side of this wall, Leslie Walker is talking about the woman at the well, and then this afternoon will be the man born blind. David Brassfield will be teaching that class. And it is the second of those, the woman at the well in John chapter 4, that is going to set the context for what we're going to be discussing during this class. That well-known incident, that well-known encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman, and so many great things that come out of that exchange between our Savior and this woman. And while that seems to be the leading thought in this part of John's Gospel, for our purposes, it serves as the backdrop. It serves as the context for something else that's going on at exactly the same time between Jesus and his disciples. And so we're in John chapter 4, and the paragraph that I want us to spend our time with is in verses 31 through 38. Let's take the time to read that this morning. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him something to eat?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say that there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap for that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor." This paragraph begins with "meanwhile." And I don't know why. I guess it's too many of those black and white B westerns on Saturdays. As a little kid, there was always that "meanwhile" followed by "back at the ranch." Meanwhile, this is going on here, but at the same time, this is going on over here. And so, meanwhile, as we said, the leading part of this, the leading story here is Jesus and the woman at the well. But while that's going on, and that very famous exchange that begins with a request for a drink of water and ends with Jesus' pronouncement that "I am the Messiah," there is another storyline. There are 2 fronts to this story. And that other front is that of the actions of the disciples on this occasion. Jesus is traveling with his apostles from Judea to Galilee. And they go through Samaria. And as you know, as Bible students, that wasn't necessarily typical of the route that Jews would take, traveling from north to south and south to north. They would tend to cross the Jordan over into Perea and avoid Samaria. But that was not what happened this time. They're traveling, and we get to the 6th hour of the day. By Jewish rendering of time, we're talking about noon. It's lunchtime. And the text tells us that they get to this place, and Jesus is wearied. Now, they've come to a place of tremendous historical significance. If this were today, they would be traveling along the highway, and there would be one of those historic marker plaques that we whiz by in our cars, and we have no idea what the historical significance of places are, but these folks knew. The landscape was dominated by two mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And the Jews and the Samaritans too, they knew the significance of those mountains, the instructions that were given to Moses, that when the people entered into the land, that they were to be brought to this very location and divided into two, half of them on Ebal, half of them on Gerizim, a reading of the blessings and the cursings of the law, and the challenge to the people to keep God's law. This is quite a significant place. But not only that, this is territory or land that served as a part of the inheritance that Joseph received from his father Jacob. This field was given to him. And in that field was a well. And even to this day, the day in which Jesus and his disciples arrived there, that well is still known as Jacob's well. This is an important place. But here they are. Jesus is tired. They're hungry. And he sits down to rest. The disciples go into the village of Sychar. It's a Samaritan village. And they go there to buy food. And when they have finished their business in town, they return back out to the well. And to their great surprise, they find that Jesus is talking to a woman. ESV, which I read and study from, typically says that they marvel at this. But apparently the wording ought to be just a tad stronger than that. They were astonished. They were shocked at what they saw Jesus doing as he spoke to this woman. And they have questions that are going in their minds. Now, the only reason we know what those are is because John, in writing the gospel, tells us what they are. What do you seek? In reference to the woman. Woman, why is it that they apparently assume that she must have instigated this conversation? She had to have. What are you looking for, woman? And of Jesus, why in the world are you even talking with this woman? The questions are here. They never come out of their mouth. But that's what they're wondering. And as they arrive, the conversation is drawing to a close, and the woman leaves hurriedly to go back into the village. She leaves her water pot there by the well because she believes that she has found the Christ. You know, Samaritans were looking for the Messiah as well. And she thinks, maybe we have found him. Maybe I have encountered him. And so she goes into town to tell the men of the village what she has found, this extraordinary stranger that she has run into at the well. And then the disciples say, Jesus, here's the food we went to buy. Let's eat. And Jesus says something to them that confuses them. He did that often, didn't he? Said things that confused the disciples. He said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. And of course their minds go to just their immediate concern, and that was their hunger and this food. Has someone brought him food to eat that we're unaware of? What's going on here? But Jesus continues to speak. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to do his work. And then he observes, you say that there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest. Now, we don't know if that 4 months, then comes the harvest was just a literal observation that Jesus made, or that this was a proverbial statement. There has been too much ink spilled in commentaries about which of those two it is. It doesn't matter because it doesn't change the message, and we don't want to lose sight of the message and the lesson that Jesus was trying to make with his disciples. Your thinking is that there's 4 months between the sowing and the harvesting. And what the point that Jesus is going to make with them, you're looking at an occasion now in which the sowing and the harvesting have come together. The harvesting is immediate. So lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. And In all likelihood, Jesus is drawing their attention to this group, this crowd of people who are making their way out of the village, out to the well. The men, the people that the woman has intrigued by her testimony of the conversation she had with Jesus at the well. And here they come. And Jesus is saying, look, harvest. The fields are white for harvest. And he goes on to make a point with them about the fact that the sower and the reaper are on this occasion, they're going to rejoice together. Typically that doesn't happen. You have the sowing and the reaping or the harvesting doesn't come till much later, right? Now, I don't have a lot of experience with farming, especially with field crops. But we did always grow a garden when I was a kid growing up, and I can remember the days that we planted the garden. And I rejoiced when that day was done. But then we would go and we would pick the produce. And I didn't necessarily rejoice at the time of the harvest. When I rejoiced is when Mom would cook the delicious meals from what we grew and put those on. Then I rejoiced. But there was a separation between the sower and the reaper or harvesting, rejoicing. And Jesus says, now that time is together here. It's together here. And so, many Samaritans are coming out. And what the very next verse, we stopped in verse 38, but verse 39 tells us many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. They came to faith. What was happening here in this village of Samaria was the very thing that John says is the purpose for which he recorded the things that he did in this gospel, so people might believe, and believing might have life in his name. Isn't that right? And here's an evidence of that very kind of thing happening, people coming to faith. He starts the gospel in chapter 1 and verse 12 by talking about those who believe in his name. And to those who believe in his name, he gives the right to become the children of God. That's what this book is about. Coming to faith in Jesus Christ. Now Jesus has proclaimed, I hate that this is behind me. Jesus has proclaimed that the fields are white. And our question is, are they still white? That's the question that we are charged with answering today. And there may be a sense in which we would tend to want to answer that question in the negative. Boy, they just aren't white. I mean, all you have to do is look at all of the cynicism and apathy that dominates our world today. Atheism seems to be on the rise, and if it's not on the rise, at least it's becoming much more vocal. People are just too shallow, too materialistic, too self-absorbed in this world today. People don't care about the Bible. Not only that, people don't even believe in the reality of absolute truth. Conversions just seem to be way too few and far between. We can go down a line of thinking that might lead us to want to answer the question in the negative that no, the fields are not still white. But before we start down that path, we need to realize what we are asking and what we are not asking. We are not asking, do people recognize their need for forgiveness and salvation and for Jesus Christ in the world today? We're not asking, is humanity concerned about sin? We're not asking, are the masses responding to the invitation of the gospel today? We're not asking, are our churches growing through conversions? We're not asking, are we planting new congregations and new communities? Those are all good questions, and they need to be talked about. But that's not what we're asking. To help us answer our question, are the fields still white? I think we can ask another series of questions to which there are obvious answers. We can ask questions like, does the world still need Jesus and his shed blood? Is sin still humanity's greatest need? or issue. Are people separated from God because of their sin? Is the gospel message still good news? Is it still the power of God to salvation? Does this seed, when planted in good and honest hearts, still produce? And we know the answer to all of those questions, don't we? And it's an absolute yes, which then leads us, I believe, to the conclusion in answering the question, are the fields still white? Adamantly, yes, the fields are still white. And the whiteness of those fields, as Jesus proclaimed them, is not based on the spiritual temperament and sensitivity of a given culture in a given time. That's not what determines their whiteness. Their whiteness instead is determined by humanity's need for salvation by the grace of God through the blood of Jesus Christ. That determines the whiteness of the fields. And so while we can, I believe, answer the question very quickly, I think there is also something that's going on in this text, though, that is, have you all ever heard of the book, The Question Behind the Question? I think there's another issue going on here that Jesus draws His disciples' attention to, that our attention needs to be drawn to as well. He's trying to make a point with these men, and it's a point that all of us need to hear and understand. So the question really is not, are the fields still white? The question is how are we responding to those white fields? That's the question. That's where the issue lies. And so what do we do? We agree that the fields are still white. What do we do with that? What do we do in response to that? And there are two things that need to happen. The first thing that needs to happen is we need to do what Jesus told His disciples to do. That's going to have to happen first. And what He told His disciples to do was look, lift up your eyes and see. And the second thing that we're going to have to do is we must do what Jesus did. And what did Jesus do? Jesus said, my food is to do the will of Him who sent me and to accomplish His work. That's what's going to have to happen. That's what is going to happen. We are going to have to lift up our eyes and see, and we are going to have to determine that what drives us as individuals and as bodies of the Lord's people is that we're going to accomplish God's work. Now, I want to look at these again, but I want to do so in reverse order. I want to come back to the statement of Jesus. You see, I made the mistake of sending in my PowerPoint for this lesson and then going back through my outline again, and I adjusted my outline, but I couldn't do anything about the PowerPoint anymore, so excuse me having to jump around here. But we come back to this statement of Jesus, my food is to do the will of Him who sent me and to accomplish His work. We know that about Jesus. That's what He was all about. It was accomplishing the will of God. But in doing that, Jesus knew that He was going to butt heads with some folks. And sometimes those folks were the ones who were closest to Him, His own disciples, because He understood that they were operating from a different set of values than that from which He was operating. He was aware of that. Jesus knew. It didn't catch Him by surprise. Perhaps one of the best known occurrences of that is at Caesarea Philippi, Matthew chapter 16, where Peter is blessed and Peter is cursed. And you remember why he was cursed, because Jesus began to make known to His disciples what was going to happen to Him. Jesus hadn't given full disclosure up to this point in time, and now He's going to begin doing that. And the reason He waited is because He knew this was going to be a difficult pill to swallow for His disciples. And Peter proved his point. Because when He said, going to go to Jerusalem, going to be apprehended, going to be persecuted, going to be killed, raised from the dead. And Peter says, no, Lord, not so. That's not what's going to happen. Peter simply gave voice to the set of values, the worldview, and the approach that he, along with all of his countrymen, had. They were looking for the coming Messiah, but they believed that when that Messiah was going to come, that the primary thing that he was going to do was affirm their place as God's chosen people, to the exclusion of everybody else. Not only that as he did so, he would come and he would be not the suffering servant, certainly not the one who was going to be killed, as Jesus had just said, but rather he was going to be the one who was going to drive out these pesky oppressors that had been dogging these people for generations and for centuries, and were finally going to get reestablished the throne of David and the kingdom likened to the kingdom of David. And that's what the Messiah is going to do. And Jesus had the audacity to show up, and that wasn't his agenda, was it? He knew that what he had come to do was different than what they were anticipating he was going to do. And so when they came back from the village, they found Jesus talking to a woman, a Samaritan woman. And they were shocked. They were startled. They were astonished. They were, what in the world is going on here? They could make no sense of what Jesus was doing. So Jesus knew this about his disciples, and what defined him was totally different. It didn't sound different, but it was different. Because what defined him was to do the will of his Father and to accomplish his work. And what was that work? What was the will of the Father? Jesus expressed it about himself and his mission as seeking and saving the lost. Previously, in this incident with his discussion with the woman, God was looking for true worshipers, wasn't he? And he had found a very likely candidate in this woman, and she in her friends. And so Jesus was attempting to accomplish the will and the work of God, and it was not lining up with his disciples' outlook and their thinking, what they thought needed to happen and should happen. But they thought they were, didn't they? They thought they were doing God's will. They believed that to be true, but in reality, it was not true. And so we have to, I think, ask ourselves this same question. What defines us and what drives us individually and as bodies of the Lord's people? Well, what we want to say, what we desperately want to say is that what drives us is doing the will of God and accomplishing his work. That's who we are, and that's what we're all about. And we could have no better determination and purpose than to accomplish that. But we have to ask ourselves a very serious question. And that is, what really does drive us? And what really does motivate us as the church and as Christians? I'll just ask you a question here. I already know the answer to it. But has there ever been an effort where you go to church to do something differently than it's been done before? And what was the response to that? Practically speaking, what drives us and what motivates us to do the things that we do or don't do? Is it really and honestly to accomplish the will of God, or sometimes does it become to maintain what makes us comfortable and what we are accustomed to, And let's not step out of sight of that in any way, shape, or form because, it's just not worth it. What Jesus shows us is that when accomplishing the work of God is truly what drives you, it will lead you to do some things that people are going to look upon with shock. It's a hard thing to think about. It's a hard thing to do. But if we're going to respond appropriately to the whiteness of the fields, then we are going to have to do what Jesus did. And we are going to have to make doing the will of God and accomplishing His work, despite what the repercussions might be, and despite the negativity that we might encounter. And we can't act like that's not true. Well, we're going to, I read a little meme, Facebook meme, said from a very experienced preacher. He said, I've been preaching for 40 years, and I've learned two things. Number one, I've learned that everybody thinks we need to change some things. And number two, nobody is willing to change anything. And we think we're going to accomplish the work of God, and in the process we're going to be able to pacify and satisfy everybody. There can only be one priority. There was only one priority in the life and the ministry of Jesus, and there can only be one priority for His body, the church, and it has to match the priority of the Master. But came across this rather interesting observation from Greg McCown, who wrote the book Essentialism. I don't know if any of you have read that book. But he makes this observation about the word priority. The word priority came into the English language in the 1400s. It was singular. It meant the very first or prior thing. It stayed singular for the next 500 years. Only in the 1900s, and other studies have borne this out, is actually in the 1940s and 50s, did we pluralize the term and start talking about our priorities. Illogically, we reasoned that by changing the word, we could bend reality. The church cannot have priorities. It has to have priority. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. Jesus, what are you doing here? Well, my food, my priority is I do the will of the Father and accomplish His work. And it's going to make some folks uncomfortable. And there are going to be folks who don't like what I'm doing. But I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for the Father. Priority. Number one, we have to do what Jesus did. The will of the Father, accomplish His work. The second thing is then that we have to do what Jesus called His disciples to do. Look, lift up your eyes and see. It's hard for us to grasp and fathom how challenging that is. We think, of course I can see. Of course I'm perceptive. I see these things, I think them through, I understand them. I am not blind. Oh, yes, we are. Yes, we are. It is a classic or problem in the relationship of people and God. Jesus dealt with it, didn't He? He talked about those who have eyes but could not see. They have ears but they can't hear. And Jesus didn't originate that. Remember, he quoted Jeremiah the prophet, didn't He? Matthew chapter 13, read that, beginning in verse 13 through verse 15. It's always been a problem, and we would be exercising the height of naivete if we thought this isn't a challenge for us as well. To lift up our eyes and to see. That's why Paul wrote Ephesians 1 and verse 18, the prayer to have the eyes of your heart enlightened, that you may know. Of course, the classic story of people's eyes being opened comes from the Old Testament when Elisha is with his assistant and they're being pursued by the Syrian armies. And they come to the village of Dothan. And the king of the Syrians learns where they're at. He brings his armies and they encircle the city. This pesky prophet, he's going to finally be rid of this man. And Elisha's servant steps out of the tent in the morning and he sees the armies of the Syrians on the hills all around them. And he is scared to death. And he complains to Elisha about that. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Elisha's prayer to God on behalf of his servant in 2 Kings 6 and 17, O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. You remember the Lord accommodated that prayer, didn't he? Because the next time the servant looked, what he saw were the chariots and horses of fire all around, surrounding the armies of the Assyrians. Let him see. Let him see, Lord. And that's his prayer for us. That was Jesus' prayer for his disciples. Lord, let them see. Let them know, Lord. We have to develop this sensitivity to what is really around us and what's going on. I want you to think with me for a moment about these disciples. When they left Jesus at the well to go into the village to buy food. You ever wonder what their experience was like in the village? How'd that go? Did they go in there with their heads down and they just transacted their business to get the food and they walk out? Or did they go in very arrogantly and haughtily and proudly? Now, we don't know because John doesn't tell us, but it's not very difficult to know what their disposition and attitude was toward Samaritans. We're told about another occasion in which James and John pled with Jesus to call down fire from heaven to consume a village of the Samaritans. That's the attitude that they had. And so whatever it was, whether they just tried to minimize any interaction or they went in very proudly and haughtily and boastfully and whatever and did their business, they had one thing in mind, didn't they? One thing in mind. They wanted to buy food because they were hungry. And they come back out and they find Jesus conversing with a Samaritan woman, and they are astonished that he would be doing something like that. And as soon as she walks off, here, Lord, let's eat. It's time to eat. And Jesus said, wait a minute. Don't you see what's going on here? Don't you understand? Can your eyes not be opened up to see? Did they view those Samaritans in that village when they went in to buy food as anything other than a source to fill their bellies at that particular moment in time and their need? Did they not see them as souls whom God loved and whom He desired? They didn't see it, did they? They didn't see it at all. And so here they come, and Jesus tells them to look, lift up your eyes. Some people think that He was encouraging to look upon fields that were full of grain, 4 months away from harvest. I tend to think that what He called upon them to look at was this group of people coming out of the village. Look at that. Look at that. I have come to accomplish my Father's will, and this is my Father's will. These disciples likely thought that they were going to go in, get the food, get out, they were going to eat their meal, and they were going to be on their way. And now, because of Jesus, they're going to have to spend 2 more days amongst the Samaritans in this village. Yet many believed. Lord, let them see. That's His prayer for us, that we might see. And it's hard. Easiest person in the world to deceive, is myself. And one of the biggest lies that I tell myself, that I believe consistently, is that my eyes are wide open and I'm seeing everything that I need to see. But I'm not. A few years ago, when we were still living in Tahlequah, we lived there. That's where we raised our kids. And we would travel on Highway 10 out of Tahlequah. It runs along the Illinois River there. I don't know if any of you have been over there. It's not your typical Oklahoma highway. It's part of the Ozarks and the mountains that have kind of spilled over into Oklahoma. And so this is one of those that if you get one of the old-time maps, it's got that colored dotted line. It's a scenic route, which means you don't go fast, and you got lots of curves, and it's beautiful. And it is. And we would go that way a lot. We traveled it a lot. One night, we were coming home well after dark, and it was one of those moonless, super dark nights. And as was typical when we travel anywhere, Tanya drives. So I get to observe everything from the passenger seat. And we came around this curve, and up in the sky was a light. And it very quickly, that's not a star. It's too big for a star. Okay? So, of course, any self-respecting American says, it's a UFO. That's what it is. It's a UFO. But as we looked at that light, we couldn't put it in a category. We couldn't identify it. What in the world is that light? Nothing is making sense here. And as we got up closer to it, we were able to tell, well, that was one of those really big hills right there, and that was the outdoor light at a house up on that hill. Now, the shocking thing is that we had no earthly idea there was a house up on the top of that hill. None. And we've been by this place dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And so I thought, okay, next time we come by here in the daylight, I've got to look. And so I did, and sure enough, beautiful, large home up on the top of this hill on the west side of the highway. On the east side of the highway are these fields that they grow hay in, and then the river is over here, and then the hill's over here. So they had an awesome view from that house. I know why they built the house where they did. But my question was, why did I never see that? All these times I've been by here and I've never seen that house up on that hill. And it didn't take me long to figure it out. Because you come around the curve from the south and that valley opens up and your eyes are drawn to the hay fields and the rivers over here. And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous scene. But my eyes were always drawn that way, which made me blind to what else was there all along to be seen. Now, I went from there, as I thought about that experience, to my own Bible study and began asking myself the question, when I come to a text, particularly a familiar text, how often am I letting my mind just go in the same direction that it's always gone and never forced myself to look and perhaps see some things that I had never seen before? But putting this all back into the context of this incident and what Jesus is trying to tell us is that we need to lift up our eyes and see that the fields are white to harvest. These disciples would have never, ever dreamed that in the category of people that we need to be interested in and concerned about and reaching out to are Samaritans. They're dogs. Who are the dogs in our experience in our life? Who are the people that we have already written off as being recipients of the gospel of Jesus Christ? Nope, can't be those folks. Not interested in them. We really aren't interested in having those kind of people around here. Lift up your eyes. Look and see. There's another thing about this that became apparent to me as well, is that when would the disciples have ever thought that talking to one woman was worth your time as someone who has such an important job of preaching the gospel? They'd seen Jesus. They'd seen the huge multitudes of people that would come after him, and he would preach to these multitudes. They would be the ones whom Jesus would send out, and they would preach in the villages and in the cities around Galilee. And did they think I don't know that they did, but it's very possible that they thought, you're wasting your time, Jesus. Why bother with this woman? Do you ever feel like be a waste of our time to talk to this person or to that person? And yet it was because of that woman that there was a crowd of people coming out from the village, and they would also encounter Jesus, and they would believe. Open your eyes. Lord, let our eyes be open. Lift up your eyes and see. Lord, help us to see. You know, there were two occasions in which Jesus proclaimed a plentiful harvest. As he was sending out the 70, going out 2 by 2. You remember that? A plentiful harvest. Another occasion was at the end of Matthew chapter 9, in which he was seeing the multitudes, and he had compassion upon them because they were dispirited. They were like sheep without a shepherd, and he proclaimed a plentiful harvest. But do you also remember what he said on both occasions in which he proclaimed a plentiful harvest? Ask that the Lord of harvest send forth reapers. People to go into those white fields and to reap the harvest of the Lord. The question honestly from this text does not lie in whether or not the fields are white. But it's what are we going to do in response to the whiteness of those fields. And to do that, we have to do what Jesus did. The will of God, and to accomplish His work.